Hello, everybody, and welcome to the fourth day of the HPP Innovation Week, the benchmark event on high-pressure processing for the food and beverage industry. So this is Oscar Garcia, Sales and Marketing Specialist at Hyperbaric. First of all, I would like to remind all the attendees that we have an open chat where you can leave for your comments that we will try to respond as soon as possible. So during this session, we'll be discussing about regulatory compliance and product validation in Oceania. And for this, we have two great speakers, two great guests here, Russell Rankin from Australia and Chris Tong. Welcome to both of you.
Thank
Great
you,
to have you here, guys. All right, so regarding the structure of the session, first of all, the two speakers will be given two individual presentations, and at the end, we'll just move forward to the last section where I will be asking three questions to both of them to keep discussing a little bit and to have a friendly conversation about this topic. All right, so let's start with you, Russell. Russell Rankin is the director at Food Innovation Partners and has more than 30 years experience in the Australian food and beverage industry in various senior commercial and research positions. He has an inherent ability to connect companies, research organizations, financial institutions, and government, and understand how to manage the innovation process and the steps required to commercialize innovative ideas. Russell has worked with Australian companies using HPP and has also developed his own fresh, chilled HPP baby food range. Russell, the audience is eager to listen to you. Sorry. You can try to share your screen.
Oscar, thank you. Can you see my screen and hear me okay?
Yeah, everything is fine. You can go ahead, Russell.
Thank you, Oscar, and thank you to Hyperbaric for the opportunity to participate in your Innovation Week. I just want to give everyone a bit of a update on what happens in Australia in terms of HPP and in terms of regulatory issues and product validation. So HPP was established initially in Australia by research undertaken by our peak federal government research agency, CSIRO, in 2001. CSIRO's research and the validation of the technology led to a launch of a number of food and beverage products in the market. And CSIRO continued to work with those commercial companies to then establish facilities that could produce the products and supply the market. Sorry about that. This just shows some of the products that are in the marketplace in Australia. And you can see there's a wide range of products. They're from avocado, we've got milk, we've got juices, and we've got ready-to-eat chicken breast. These are just a few of the ones that are in Australia. In terms of getting regulatory approval in Australia, the food production is controlled by Food Standards Australia and New Zealand. And although Food Standards doesn't specifically have any regulations around HPP, they're looking for outcome-focused results. In other words, they want equivalent kill rates for microbiological contamination. So the regulators require verification of the processing technology. And so HPP operators need to provide documentation to show that there has been a suitable reduction of the identified pathogens that could be of concern to the food manufacturer. And often, this sort of work may involve a challenge test to verify the effectiveness of the manufacturing process. And the regulations also ensure that HPP isn't used for cleaning up low-grade ingredients. So it's important that a certificate of analysis is also provided to the regulators on the raw materials being used in the final product. This is just a quick overview of the type of products, the shelf life you might expect in Australia in terms of the regulations, and the equivalence target. And so the HPP needs to be able to show it can do an equivalent to what is currently accepted in the marketplace by the regulators. I just want to turn now, Oscar, and give everyone a bit of a rundown of a case study in Australia. This is a product that is produced in Sydney and it's produced under the name Made by Cow, and it is one of the very first of the HPP milks. I think the first one was in Mexico, I believe, Oscar. Natural raw milk, consumers believe, has some health benefits around allergies and intolerances. So consumers are looking for less processed products to eat, and they believe that a HPP milk has a greater content of nutritional value for them. So CBH Fresh, the company that produces Made by Cow, formed a partnership with a dairy farmer in New South Wales in Australia, the third generation dairy farmers, and they work closely with them to get well-controlled milk production processes so that they could ensure that the product that they were HPPing was of the highest quality standard. And they worked with the regulatory agencies, the New South Wales Food Authority, to get approval for HPP as an alternative to heat pasteurisation and sell cold pressed raw milk. The government does not consider it to be raw milk, but it can be marketed as cold pressed raw milk. And this product has been extremely successful and was launched in the market in 2016. So that just gives you an idea of an interesting case that looked at the regulatory issues as well as the consumer issues. I just want to quickly touch on future developments in Australia in relation to HPP. Australia has undertaken next generation development, and we're looking here with a number of companies at ready-to-eat meals, beverages, and vegetable products. And CSIRO, our premier research organisation, has developed a patented high-pressure thermal process, which is a combination of pressure and temperature. As you know, most commercial HP treatments are carried out at 5 to 25 degrees C, which we'd consider as cold, whereas the HPTP, or high-pressure thermal process, is carried out at 60 degrees and above. And Hyperbaric are working closely with CSIRO to bring this technology to market. The temperature is applied during pressure treatment through a modified HPP canister, eliminating microbial spores, and a product that can be ultimately shelf stable but have the quality of a fresh product. Consumer trends that are really aligned with HPP, I see here in Australia, are ready-to-eat meals, minimal processing, which consumers are looking for. They're looking for products that don't have a long list of ingredients. They're concerned about the environment and sustainability. They want to reduce waste. They want a better eating experience. They want improved health, clean labels, and they're looking to plant-based meats and dairy foods. And the HPP technology can help deliver consumers with these sort of product attributes. So I think the future for HPP in Australia is pretty bright. And thanks everyone for your attention. And thank you, Oscar.
Thank you, Russell, for the presentation. It's been great to listen to all the interesting information and details you explained really clearly and practical information here. Just I would like to tell to the audience that yesterday we had a session with Cesaro, precisely talking and discussing a little bit about this solution that Russell mentioned, the high pressure, high temperature technology that we have developed in close collaboration. So I really recommend it to have a look at it. Actually, it will be the recording of that session that will be at the disposal of all the registrants of the HPP Innovation Week. All right, so now it's time for Chris. Welcome, Chris. So Kristen is the Director and Innovation Engineer of Food Scope Limited, a New Zealand company focused on identifying and providing process development, validation, and commercialization of food process technologies. Chris is an experienced food process engineer who has worked with high process processing across a range of food and beverage projects. He has been a key proponent in promoting HPP within the New Zealand food industry and has worked with regulatory agencies and defining criteria for HPP industry guidance. Chris, this is your turn. I will, yeah, activate your screen. Yeah, everything is perfect. You can go ahead with your presentation.
Great. Thank you very much, Oscar. Pleasure to be invited to this event and to be able to present from a New Zealand perspective on the regulatory compliance and validation within New Zealand. So just quickly, a little bit about my business. So FoodScope provides specialist food process engineering services, particularly process development, process validation, and identifying novel opportunities for food producers who want to use new or alternative food process technologies. So the food and beverage industry in New Zealand, we're quite a small country with around 5 million people. And so food is predominantly exported to most of the other continents. Most of the food exported is predominantly commodity based. So dairy products, fruit, meat and seafood, with a small amount of beverages predominantly made up of wines. But within this category, I think there exists opportunities to create value-added products of these commodities, and we can leverage technologies such as high-pressure processing to be able to do this. Just looking at the current capability on high pressure in New Zealand, we have around 12 machines, and that's across a range of sizes. So if we look firstly at the lab scale, in our Auckland region, we have from say 300 millilitres up to a 2 litre scale, with the 300 millilitre capable of doing some pathogen work, and the 2 units predominantly focused on research and some validation work. We're quite lucky in New Zealand that we have a food innovation network, and within that network we have a couple of high pressure pieces of equipment, a 55 litre in our Auckland area and a 3 litre down at our Massey University Academic Institute. And the main reason behind these two is for consumers and companies to be able to come in and test their products on high pressure. So bringing in different packaging, different food types, testing the process, the concept, and also taking it to commercialization and doing some semi-commercial market feasibility runs out of our Auckland Innovation Centre when available. A couple of toll processors in Auckland, both operating quite small machines, 55 litres, and they're predominantly doing a range of salads and juices. And then we have our main processors scattered across the country, across a range of different machine sizes. So the predominant industry here is pet food, juices, and we also have a processor that's working in seafood in the mussel extract industry. So obviously that's a few different units around the country, although there is definitely capability for more within the New Zealand food and beverage industry, but there's a few hurdles that we face when it comes to commercialization. Firstly, there's, as I mentioned, we're quite a small country and are focused on exporting some of these products. And I think there's always a balance between, say, the shipping time, the shelf life available, and the shipping cost associated with it. Some of the companies that are very interested in utilizing the technology also have quite unique products that require validation aspects. And for the smaller companies, the cost of validation and the availability of validation centres within New Zealand to conduct these studies is fairly limited. There's also the capital costs, so the capital outlay of a piece of equipment. Some customers struggle with that, or if they're wishing to go from, say, a startup environment to a toll processing environment and then move on to their own factory, that pathway can sometimes be a little bit difficult for them. And then finally, just the industry education. It's certainly improved over the last few years. The Food Innovation Network's been very good at promoting through workshops the technology, some of the capability, but some consumers and some customers also have a lack of understanding around the potential limitations and also what's required from a compliance point of view in New Zealand. So just looking at the food regulations, the primary food law in New Zealand is the Food Act of 2014. And so similar to Russell, we also have the food standards across both Australia and New Zealand. It operates slightly differently in New Zealand in the fact that the FSANZ is mainly focused on the labelling of food, also the composition of food, so things such as the standards of identity, and the microbiological limits in foods. So understanding certain foods might have criteria for, say, Listeria or Salmonella that has a limit that needs to be kept under when producing a food that's safe to eat. And then also the food standards looks at any novel foods or any new novel process technologies that might exist or come into play. Our main regulatory agency is the Ministry for Primary Industries, and so they also develop and enforce these food regulations within New Zealand. So they're particularly focused around our primary industry, so our dairy, our meat, our seafood, and so develop the procedures and the regulations around processing and producing a safe food. So as part of that, they also produce guidance documents for processors who perhaps don't understand some of the methods and processes to go through to be compliant. And this just outlines some of the information in, there might be documents around, say, thermal processing or smoking of products, commercial sterility. So in regards to how this relates to high pressure, so the high pressure hasn't been considered a novel process since 2013 in New Zealand, and so there's no labelling requirement for high pressure foods to define them as such. The main standard, and this is the little bit of difference between Australia and New Zealand, our main standard from a food standards Australia and New Zealand point of view is the microbiological limits in food. So ensuring that the foods that we're producing as defined in here, that we're not exceeding the limits for each of the pathogens of interest. For high pressure, there's also a few other standards that need to be met. So for example, if you're producing a food, the packaging itself need to make sure that there's no chemical migration from the package to the food itself. There's standards around if you're looking at leveraging the minimal processing nature of the technology. So touting better vitamin retention or reduced sodium. So if you're putting these claims on the label, then that also needs to be adhered to as part of the standard. And another one might be if you're producing a fairly unique food using a high pressure process, it might use, say, synergistic additives such as bacteriocins, niacin, for example. Then there's maximum doses that need to be adhered to within the standards as well. From a food safety point of view, so food businesses in New Zealand operate on a risk-based system, so using HACCP principles. So in general, depending on how risky the food will depend on the program or the level of documentation that's required. So lower level risk foods in New Zealand typically operate to what we call our national programs, which we have National Program 1, 2, and 3, based on the food, based on the risk to public health. Moving into a higher level of risk, we then have food control plans, which have more documentation and process control required around them that the producer needs to provide. And then at the higher level, particularly on our primary industries, we have what's called our risk management programs, which are a lot stricter around how they're controlled and regulated. They undergo much more stringent verification and evaluation as part of operating these programs. So in terms of defining some of the standards that are required for high pressure processes, as I mentioned, there's not specific criteria across all of the different products. And so when developing a document for use in, say, the HACCP-based system, people can generally look at things such as overseas FDA juice HACCPs if they're doing juice or other codex measures to be able to form a body of evidence for them to develop a high pressure process. So I also mentioned industry guidance documents for other areas of industry, and it wasn't until recently that we actually had some guidance in New Zealand for producers. There's certainly been a demand over the last few years, particularly when Russell's crew over in Australia, they released their milk. There was quite a few farmers that were interested in looking at that as a process. And it sort of drove industry and it drove MPI to commission a report through our Crown Research Institute, ESR, just looking at pasteurization equivalents using high pressure processing. And so that was released a couple of years ago, with the main outcomes defining that there's certainly not a safe harbor when using high pressure. We can't have one size fits all across the range of food products, and that there's key considerations when defining what you would need to perform in terms of validation from a high pressure process. As an outcome of this report, they developed and released a guidance document in February of this year. And as part of that guidance document, there were a series of templates, and these templates are just for the producers to work through if they want to validate an HPP product or produce a product, just to give them the sufficient understanding and evidence required to ensure they're producing a safe food. So when breaking down the three different categories from MPI, firstly, there's the functional side of things. So activities such as shucking, texture modification that you might see in crustaceans or bivalve mollusks, not so much of a food safety concern, so wasn't really considered as such as part of the documents. Then we have the shelf life extension aspect of it. So activities that may have a food safety hurdle in place, but extra shelf life extension is desired from the consumers. And then finally, products that need to go a pathogen inactivation. So where we're looking at using high pressure as the primary food safety step to ensure that the product's acceptable for sale into the market. And so as part of these guidance documents, it gives information around the producers to think about what they're doing. So starting point is obviously your intended consumer, your intended use, what are your storage conditions and your desired shelf life? And then are you needing to conduct a shelf life extension or a pathogen inactivation study? And there's a whole raft of information that also needs to be considered as part of this. From a product consideration perspective, what's your food matrix? What's your characteristics of your product, your pH, your water activity, some of the spoilage organisms that you might expect, what organisms are you going to need to target? What are you packaging the food in? What's the size? How much headspace, volume? Is it food contact compliant? And also the processing aspect. So what are you trying to achieve from it, from a reduction of microorganisms? What organisms are the most pressure resistant? And then obviously the criteria in the HPP process that you're going to need to use or will look to use to be able to meet your requirements. So this is just an example of one, a part of an example of one of the templates. This is a shelf life template. It might be a little bit too small to see, but it sort of gives an understanding of some of the detail that's required to go into. So there's three templates that were developed. There's the shelf life extension template. There's also a template that's been developed for any producer wanting to conduct challenge trials or validation studies from a microbial inactivation point of view. And then finally, a template for labs. So obviously a lab's a key part of this, but they also need to have an understanding of what their requirements are for, say, enumerating and inoculating when conducting these trials. So just digging a bit deeper into some of the data that's required, and this is a summary from the templates. So if you would like more information, please have a look at the templates and it will give a bit more detail. So firstly, you need the resources. So the producer needs to ensure that they're using a skilled person to conduct the validation that has experience in HPP and understands some of the requirements and the subtle nuances around a high pressure process. As I mentioned, an accredited laboratory needs to be used, and alongside the information provided to them, they need to have skills to be able to conduct some of these tests. And then also the equipment that's being used. Obviously, for some validation studies, they might be conducted in a lab scale equipment. So I mentioned a 300 milliliter equipment that's available in New Zealand. But then if you're scaling to commercial, so 55 litre, 250 litre, 525 litre, then there's obviously some subtle differences that you need to understand when going from the smaller scale to the larger scale that need to be included in your validation study. From the microbiological point of view, so documentation needs to be around what strains you're going to be using, what cocktails, what are the pathogens of interest, and you need to select some pressure-resistant strains as well to give you that worst-case scenario that you should be conducting your validation study on. Also shelf life, so looking at the sampling program, how you intend to sample it, your storage conditions. And then onto process, so documenting your process quite clearly. So once again, you might be creating a worst case scenario. So documentation of your temperatures, so obviously your product temperatures, your compression fluid temperatures, pre and post, understanding your compression and your decompression rates of your high pressure processing system, particularly if you're looking at going from lab to small scale, when that can vary significantly. And then, quite importantly, you also need your actual pressure achieved and your holding time that you're working on. So as you fill out all this information, gather all this data, you can also use other sources. So things such as previously validated products, reference material from scientific journals, codes of practice. So equipment suppliers such as Hyperbaric have a wealth of information on products that they've conducted work on previously, or other suitable experts can provide some information as well. So once all this information and the validation study is conducted, then there's a requirement to review your results. So what's your actual log count reduction versus how much you are required, or you've set down to actually achieve. Also understanding your shelf life results. Did it achieve your desired shelf life? Are you testing pathogens at the end of shelf life? Have you ensured that you've taken into account sublethal recovery of some pathogens as well? So once all this information has been put together, you should have a series of defined validation parameters, which you can then take and put into place as a part of your document informing your HACCP plan for your particular product. So that will form the HPP component, and you obviously have upstream and downstream components of that HACCP plan that will then determine the overall process and process control that you need to have in place for manufacturing using this technology. Just to give you an example of a product that does have criteria defined within New Zealand. So as I mentioned, when the interest in raw milk took off, MPI started defining criteria for this. So you'll see here that we have most of the general pathogens of interest. So for producing raw milk that we want to cold pasteurize in New Zealand, there's a requirement for a 5 log reduction across most of those pathogens. But as soon as we look at exporting the product, there's a requirement to go much higher to around that 7 log reduction. And that's just to give sort of a minimum baseline. If we're looking at some of the access requirements into some other countries internationally, it gives a good starting platform from which to base your validation, base your potential export capability of your product on. So you will notice one pathogen down there that's quite specific to New Zealand, and that's the Mycobacterium imbovis, in which we're required to do surrogate studies using Mycobacterium avium paratuberculosis. And this just raises a point that obviously if we're conducting a validation study of milk in New Zealand and we'd like to export that overseas, that it might not necessarily be the complete study that we need to perform. So if we were trying to get it into, say, the US, then you'd need to consider Coxiella burnetii. And if it was other countries, then there might be other organisms that would need to be considered as part of the validation study. So really, it's about the producer thinking about what's required based on their target market and what they actually need to achieve as part of this. So that just gives an overview of some of the information, the data required for processes to work through as part of developing the HPP process. So thank you very much for listening.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Chris, for your interesting insights on this topic and for sharing your broad experience with us. Okay, now we'll move forward to the question section. So, guys, just please feel free to discuss, to have a friendly conversation. I think it will be the most interesting thing for the audience. So, let's start with the first one. After regulatory aspects, in your opinion, what would be the second challenge that companies face when looking at implementing HPP in their processes?
Well, Oscar, here in Australia, I think the greatest challenge is ensuring we got consumer awareness of HPP and what it can do for foods. And and is a benefit for the consumer. The consumer is always interested in the benefit that it provides to them. So I think we've got to make sure there's awareness and education of consumers.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I mean, if you see what the consumers are after these days, it's certainly around more pure, minimally processed food. And I think it's understanding that high pressure is able to provide some of those requirements for those foods that they're looking at, and give the benefit of giving extended shelf life whilst also maintaining a lot of those qualities. I know within New Zealand, another of the some of the issues that I sort of spoke a little bit about in my presentation was around that pathway to commercialization. So, from the perspective of going from a startup to a whether it's a tolling facility or a capital expenditure to purchase their own unit, that can be quite difficult for some of the smaller companies within New Zealand, and so that's tends to be a bit more of a challenge that we sort of need to determine how best to overcome for some of our more unique products here.
And the other thing too, Oscar, to consider about here in Australia is what's the effect on the price, the selling point of the product in the market? Are consumers willing to pay a premium price for a benefit in the product that they're going to purchase?
Yeah, we completely agree here at Hyperbaric. That all you said is completely true. I mean, it's really tricky to communicate these benefits to the consumers and also to retailers in a, let's say, in a simple way and understandable way, with all the benefits and all the technology behind it. So yeah, I think it's a key point for the industry to coordinate all together to unify the main claims or how to label the HPP product so it's easy to identify it. So regarding this, the Cold Pressure Council, the CPC, is working hard from the US to coordinate the industry. They have launched a couple of years ago a common logo for HPP brands so they can use it, and yeah, it will be easier for the consumer to recognize them in the supermarket and so on. And yeah, and these corporate council actions are extending now to Europe, and the intention is during the following years to go to the rest of the world. So yeah, let's see
And,
how it
and
goes.
and more products in the market will help to raise that awareness as well.
Yeah, that's it. Completely. So yeah, actually we had this session. I think it was yesterday. Yeah, with the corporate council about commercialization and marketing the benefits of HPV products. So I can recommend it to have a look at it. All right, let's move now to the second question. How supportive had your governments been in the utilization of HPV as a food process technology in your countries?
Well, let me go first, Oscar. In Australia,
Yep.
I think the governments have been very supportive. As you or well, your viewers may not be aware, the food standards are set by the federal government, but their enforcement is set at the state government level. So in terms of ensuring that your products and your processes are compliant, you work with the state governments, and they haven't been standing in the way of developments. They've been supportive, as was shown in the Made by Cow case. And the advantage we've got in Australia is the federal government provides and state governments provide grants. They'll match dollar for dollar for new innovative development in food.
Oh, that is great. I mean, we know cases in many other countries in the world that they don't even have any regulation, or the government just don't put the things as easy as you just mentioned in Australia. So, yeah, I think all the food and beverage manufacturers that want to implement this PP, of course, will appreciate this kind of help and support of their governments for sure. What about
Yeah.
New Zealand, Chris?
Yeah, I know certainly over here, the government wants to work quite closely with innovative companies around developing their products that are more value added style streams. And so, case in point is, I guess, how quickly MPI sort of jumped on with looking at developing some guidelines around high pressure, because the industry just wasn't sure of what to do and how they could move forward. And there was a lot of backwards and forwards initially. So I think that this would certainly provide more information to them. In terms of funding, so we do have some R&D grants available, and there have been some smaller projects that have utilised these grants to look at HPP, and so that's sort of work in progress. And in terms, I think that comes back to the last point we were discussing around education and understanding around some of the opportunities that are available for some of these people to be able to utilize the technology that might assist in them pushing forward with some projects to be able to leverage it a bit better.
Yeah. Okay, thank you for the insights again. Let's move to the last and third questions here. So, what's your view on HPP fitting into the clean, green, pure image of Australian and New Zealand industries?
Well, in Australia, Oscar, I think it fits nicely with the strategy of the country and the food manufacturers, because HPP can be advantageous in reducing food waste by extending chilled shelf life, and it's a natural, so you can have less preservatives needed in your food products, which consumers are looking for. That their consumers are looking for sustainability. They're looking for short ingredient lists, no additives that are unnecessary. So they're wanting to get back to a more clean, pure, whole food. Here in Australia, and I'm sure it's the same with Chris in New Zealand.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it comes down to that image of pure, and what that's defined in a food is minimal ingredients, minimal processing, everything very minimal, as close as possible to what you would expect from a natural raw food. And so definitely an opportunity here. I mean, we both have, both our countries have very good sort of primary industries and very interesting products in our export range. And I think just some of the opportunities are available. We've already seen them come through. I mean, Russell's already identified some in Australia coming through in the dairy industry, even the plant-based industry, which is obviously taking off significantly. We're starting to see a lot more in there as well. So I think that sort of just fits quite nicely in amongst all this pure image and how that's portrayed based on the products that we manufacture.
It's
Yeah,
able to deliver to the consumer the promise. HPP is the technology to help with that.
yeah, that's it. There's so many benefits, completely aligned with the consumer trends, as you saw, Russell, in your presentation, and all these that you mentioned, the minimally processed, the sustainability, all together with being conventional. So I think, yeah, it gathers quite a lot of advantages that the consumer appreciate nowadays. So yeah, thank you both of you. It's been a pleasure to have all of you as panelists today. Really, I think it's difficult to explain it better in such a practical, friendly, and understandable way. Regulation is always tough to explain and might sound boring and difficult to understand. You you really focus on the practical issues here, and I really appreciate that. I hope the audience as well. So I just would like to indicate that tomorrow we'll have the session HPV in Oceania, an innovative and pioneer region, with the participation of 3 of our clients in Australia and New Zealand. So I kindly recommend this session for all of you to follow it live. And well, we have been mentioning different sessions of the HPV Innovation Week. So yeah, revise the program, book it in your calendar, and we hope you enjoy it. You can enjoy it, all the different sessions according on the different topics we have prepared. Okay, thank you guys, thank you everybody, and goodbye.
Thank you, Oscar. Thank you, viewers.
Bye.
Bye.